NIO Tesla Zeekr IDE profitability. There's a lot that I want to cover in this video. So if you don't have time or prefer to jump around rather than watch all the way through, just click down in the description. I'll share the links with all the references that I offer here, and then also the timestamps that I'll create to make it easier for you to navigate, so you don't have to watch the video all the way through to the end unless you choose to do so, which of course you're welcome if you want to do that. But let's start with IDE, because this is the idea behind IDE in my mind was to choose a company that had a huge long-term growth potential. And that's what I think NIO and NIO stock represents. Now, the idea behind the IDE and relative to, if you were to classify businesses, and you basically have two different categories. One would be on the left-hand side here, SME, that's small, medium enterprise. The other would be on the right-hand side, IDE, innovative driven enterprise. And this is sort of the growth trajectory for each. Very different, because as you see on the right-hand side, and the way I look at the IDE is typically they have a much bigger global footprint potential, which means they can get to more markets or regions of the globe, but they also need time to invest and build into that footprint. And so that's one of the reasons I have no problem with NIO continuing to invest heavily, because of their positioning and because of the long-term view that I have. Also, I think it's worth noting the guy running the company whose vision this is, William Lee, he's talked about 2030. And so my thinking is, if this guy is making it very clear that he is long-term in his view, why would we as investors think otherwise or think that he's going to shift that? And frankly, his long-term view falls in line with my view of this as an IDE, in that it needs more time, more investment to take over and have a bigger global footprint across different markets and regions. And I think we will see it play out. In the comments over the weekend, I did a video called, and I talked about NIO and XPeng or XPEV and Li Auto, and why I don't consider them to be comparable, or really competitors for each other. And so this is one of the comments in my response. This comment says, or asks the question, why is NIO an IDE? Because of battery swap? This was my response. The energy play alone with NIO allows it the potential to reach more global markets than any other Chinese EV maker. This is likely why CYVN and the UAE or / Middle East are so interested in it. And it is also likely why so many major manufacturers from China are partnered with NIO for battery swap and to get a piece of the energy business. Those are just examples of why I consider NIO an IDE. The battery as a service on its own, that subscription, the creativity, and the battery asset company, all the different entities that NIO is building out, some with partners, some without. This is exactly what I'm talking about as an IDE. The more of those things that there are, the more investment it takes early on, which is also why I like them bringing in partners, because now they're sharing the investment costs. They're helping absorb some of the costs, which ultimately, even if they're going to share profits down the road, it still could mean bigger profits for NIO. And that's my view. There was another follow-up. Someone said, what is an IDE? So my response was, IDE equals innovative driven enterprise. IDE companies can be very disruptive and have a large global footprint. They often invest heavily early on while positioning to make profits in a large market or multiple markets over time. And I just think the description is very fitting and accurate for NIO. Also, let's pivot and talk about profitability, because somebody asked in the comments about that. So this was the question was, what is your expectation timeline for profitability? And then the next question, how much longer do you anticipate these low stock prices? And oof, I said, both are hard questions to answer. And I've changed my view on profitability because I want to give the company more time. And this was also as I realized they are still building things out. And that means more investment. But at some point, the vehicles and or other revenues, that's how they usually show them in their earnings reports, should still tip things to profitability. I'm hoping William Lee will give us a hint about this in the earnings on November 20th. But if I want to be conservative, I will say after the ramp of Firefly, so probably late 2025 or early 2026 for profitability. Stock price might be dependent on big money flowing back to Chinese stocks. The simplest indicator of that might be to watch Alibaba, ticker is BABA, as it remains sub $100. Hard to imagine NIO would rocket up outside of a short squeeze with such negative sentiment and price action continuing for most Chinese stocks. I wanted to offer that since the questions were great questions, tough ones, but I wanted to field them and respond and share that as well. And this is in that video, I forgot to include a Zeekr, but as I was looking at Zeekr and pulling them up, and this is Zeekr with their failed to deliver. Now, this stock has not been listed very long. And interestingly enough, I would say the vehicles they're selling are more comparable to NIO than either Li Auto or XPeng. What's interesting in this case with the FTD chart and this recent history, and this is what I wanted to point out, is the peak essentially for fails to deliver represented by the white lines was early on, right away when it was listed from May. And it was from May 10th here that we're showing the highest levels into about May 22nd. There were still some into early June. But here's what's interesting to me is I've been kind of thinking in my mind, and I mentioned in videos, I'm wondering if there are a lag time where we can kind of get an idea of how long the FTDs, when they're reported, are going to impact the stock. And this being such a recent chart with so little data on it, maybe it isn't representative of what we can watch, but I'm now going to pay a little more attention to about a 3-month window, and this is why. The peak, as I said, May 10th, 2024, the low point was August 9th. So we're talking about May to June, June to July, July to August. That's a 3-month time frame from where the peak was reported. And then this is how long roughly it took 3 months for this thing to go down to its low. And then it stayed low for a while. And we'll see what happens moving forward. But again, this is a very different chart because it's so much smaller. It's so much more recent data. Now, if we look at the NIO chart, I think these big spikes are what caught my attention, but there's just been a lot more going on here in the recent months. And so, until we get the new updated data, I don't know what to expect. NIO stock tried to move up in spite of these, trailing and recent trailing FTDs spiking, but the full history tells a bigger story, I think. And that's where, if we look at when NIO stock started to shoot the first time, when it made that really big run, and in about a 6-month time frame, it went from $3.50 to 55 or higher. And so in 6 months, that's a big move. But what we saw during that time frame was initially there were fails to deliver, and then they dropped off. And there's probably what's the range here from September of 2020, and almost none reported until a couple months later, November. And even then, much, much smaller numbers. And we had really big volume, on an average trade day. So here's an example, random day. I'm just picking here, over 283 million shares traded, and the price ranging from, well, it's in the $60 range, up to almost 67 and down to 62-ish. So that's just one of the things, and one of the indicators for the short term is, what's the trade volume look like? Obviously, if there's less trade volume and there are companies, entities, shorts who want to suppress stock price, it's easier for them to do when there's not as much trade volume or interest in the stock. And so that's just in mind. I'm keeping it in mind, keeping all of that sort of as we track things. If we go back to Tesla and look at Tesla from its original listing, 2010, and it's trading, in a $1 range at that time. Now, what you'll see over the course of time is eventually, once they show profitability, and again, if this is the blueprint overview for an IDE, an innovative driven enterprise, it takes them a lot of investment to get to a point where they can show profits. And then at that point, the short thesis gets crushed and you see the stock rocket up and take off. Now, this is the fail to deliver chart for for Tesla. And one of the things that I wanted to pull up, I don't think we can go the full history because I think it only shows data back to 2014. That's why I wanted to show that the stock has been traded longer than that. But the concept overview, I think, will be pretty obvious as we go back. Oh, it does show the full history. Great. Perfect. So we've got all the way back to 2010. And look at these elevated FTD levels for Tesla early on in those years. And look at the depressed stock price through all those years. Now, if it was listed in 2010, 10 years in would be 2020. And that's about when the stock price took off and really started rocketing. There were a few things that happened for it. S&P inclusion definitely helped. Full year of profitability definitely helped. But what you'll see is, even though there are still some fails to deliver coming in the recent years, it is nowhere near what it was in those early years prior to Tesla getting to profitability. That profitability is a tipping point, I think, for a lot of not just the short thesis getting crushed, but also for the company to, let's say NIO with its battery as a service, and folks are still either unaware of the importance of the power swap stations and the energy play that NIO has. And even if they don't like the idea of battery as a service, well, guess what? At a certain point, once the profits are shown to be very strong, it doesn't matter what the opinions are. And that's why I think IDEs can show the best upward trajectory on the stock price, because it's consistent with the IDE growth, that explosive growth. And again, if you envision all of this time frame before profitability to be in line for Tesla, let's say, as this time frame where they're building out, investing, trying to get to a position where they can eventually show profits, and then they show profits, then you see the stock price reflect that as it absolutely rocketed. Now, I also think that the high level of FTDs for so many years actually contributed to ultimately maybe the biggest short squeeze we've seen that can still be rewarded with high volatility up and down. And we've seen it up recently. And I just think it's so fascinating to kind of do this overview and look at it in terms of an IDE. Now let's go back to the NIO chart, because what's really interesting about the NIO chart is NIO has not shown profitability. They are obviously, they have not been listed over 10 years, which is what it took for Tesla on the market to really get that pop. But it was after a full year of profitability for Tesla, and then also the inclusion in the S&P. Interestingly enough, though, NIO stock has still run to higher levels earlier, even without showing profits. And I have no idea if that means it has, an equal or greater or lesser potential moving forward. But I also don't want to ignore the reality of that, because it is really interesting to think about that and to consider that NIO has already had a big move with the stock price, and yet it hasn't shown the profitability yet. But as I said from very early on in this video, and repeatedly over the course of the time I've been doing videos, this has always been a long-term play. I wanted to give the company the time it needs. And if frankly that time frame ends up being further out, I'm fine with it, as long as they have a bigger global footprint potential that they're able to take over. And I think the energy play is a hugely unrecognized possibility for that. There are regions and countries that may benefit from the mini power plant option that NIO can provide, and we just don't know what that looks like yet. So again, it all comes back to being consistent and in line with the guy running the company, whose view is long term. I don't expect him to change that. If this is a true IDE, which I think it is, why wouldn't we want to give it time? But that's my view, my take. And by the way, I still plan on coming back and doing a video. It's going to be even longer though, where I'll talk about, and we'll look at FTDs for Amazon, Netflix, NVDA, Tesla, and NIO, and do some comparison and see what those look like, because I think we'll see some similarities with those other companies, kind of like what we saw with Tesla when we dove in and looked at it a little bit. Anyway, thanks for stopping by. Have a great day. I'll be back with more content before you know it. See y'all again very soon.